posted on Facebook and was arrested on the 5th of November. He was charged with defamation under Article 660 of the Burma Telecommunication Law 2 because he is, in his poem he says that he tattooed the president onto his penis. And as a result, his wife, he said, was disconsolate. He's not actually married. In his defence, he said that the president could be anyone. I'm wearing a white wristband in support of him. I've got some in a tin here. If you'd like to collect some off me afterwards, please do come and say hi. I realised writing this poem that I'm terrible at writing erotica, but I thought that I would write erotica for the presidents, which could be any one of them. Could be any president. There are 193 countries in the world with active presidents right now, and yes, the following poem could be about any four of those presidents. Mr. President's incredible bed tattoo. Mr. President was already hot and busy cooking his country's national dish when there was a knock at the door. When he answered the door, there in the cramped light of the doorway was a figure he recognised. Mr. President? Mr. President turned his head to Mr. President. Mr. President. And then he let his bad comb-over swing down suggestively. Mind if I come in? Any time, said Mr. President, in his soothing voice that he sometimes saved for talking about school children and national service. Mr. President pulled Mr. President close to him. Mr. President kissed Mr. President hard on the lips as Mr. President expertly pushed his hand down Mr. President's trousers to feel Mr. President's throbbing, largely autocratic power. While Mr. President teased Mr. President with a soft nibble on Mr. President's lower lip, Mr. President knew when he was being made to feel welcome. Mr. President could feel himself getting hard through his suit trousers, which fit uncomfortably, and Mr. President let out a small moan, the kind he normally saved for conversations about natural disasters. Mr. President reached under Mr. President's suit jacket, pushing it from the slightly decrepit shoulders of Mr. President, who lost his pin badge of the national flag in a frenzy. Want to take this upstairs, Mr. President? So much, said Mr. President, who lost his pin badge again. Mr. President, are you in the army? How so, Mr. President? Because, Mr. President, you just made my privates stand to attention. Just as Mr. President was gripping Mr. President hard on the buttocks, he said, you know, speaking of privates, there are 3 more presidents upstairs. Another 3 presidents resident, Mr. President? I better make sure I don't get too excited too quickly, said Mr. President, in the tone he normally used to describe segregating parts of society based on their religious beliefs. Mr. President carried Mr. President up the marble stairs. It was a bit of a stagger and he tripped up a little bit, but then he recovered. Oh, Mr. President, won't you talk dirty to me? Heard the election results? Shh, said Mr. President. Not now, as though he was being asked about election fraud. Mr. President and Mr. President felt the easy weight of each other's cocks, unable to bear the tension much longer. Up in the state bedroom, that's where they found 2 other presidents, barring one another enthusiastically, as if one Mr. President was an incumbent with offspring who had passports in another country. Any excuse to bar a presidential incumbent. Mr. President threw Mr. President onto the bed with Mr. President and Mr. President. Mr. President said softly, encouragingly, Mr. President, I want you so bad. Oh, God, the Mr. President swore in unison. Mr. President thrust once, cautiously, into Mr. President, as Mr. President also thrust into the forgiving pleasure of Mr. President, lavishing his chest with attention. Mr. President was filled with an overriding sense of what was gone, of what was careening into nowhere, and the kind of ecstasy of freedom his country might be enjoying if Mr. President chose to loosen his gag laws. Mr. President sucked Mr. President, seeing the tattoo he had of Mr. President on his penis enter his lips as he ran his tongue slowly across it, letting Mr. President leave quietly. Mr. President grunted as Mr. President swore, and Mr. President moved down and down on Mr. President, and the Mr. Presidents were living in seconds of soaring, agonizing perfection, eyes watering with that same kind of almost tearful, joy-filled despair that comes with the end of the night and the knowledge that you are just a puppet for greater interests, and that the real power is financial or military, or taking the rights away from individual people, like proper access to medical care and education provided by the state and free from the influence of religion, and the way those kinds of tears can sting and blot on the pillow until the salt of the dried, previous tears scratches his face. Mr. President straddled Mr. President, and Mr. President placed the palm of his hand on Mr. President's naked back like it was a Bible, pulling his cock closer to that purple-red spot, which looked as he slowly spread Mr. President's cheeks more and more like Mr. President's country's national animal. Mr. President, and Mr. President continued to ride one another harder when something took a hold of them from somewhere deep that crossed the shortened divide between the lower back and the heart. a contraction, a spasm of civil disobedience, internal love for their fellow man, and all that was corrupted about land ownership and the question of foreign investment flowered out of them, a sweet and fitful spasm which pulled the Mr. Presidents into a kind of power vacuum in which no villages could be burned or peoples displaced or borders contested, and just as quickly after the ceasefire, the deepest peace grew silently, naturally, permanently across them, and for the first time in a long time, they kept that vision in mind. Thank you very much.